Hey y'all, it's entry number 65 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Davante Adams, wide receiver, Las Vegas Raiders. We'll start with the positives with Davante Adams' fantasy profile, volume and red zone usage. In 2021, Davante Adams had the highest target rate in the NFL with 35.3%, the second highest target share with 31.6%, and the second most targets in general with 169 according to Player Profiler. He's been equally dominant in the red zone, ranking third in the league in red zone targets in 2021 with 31, first in red zone targets in 2020 with 32, tied for the fourth most red zone targets in 2019 with 21, first in red zone targets in 2018 with 32, tied for the fourth most red zone targets in 2017 with 24, and had the fifth most red zone targets in 2016 with 25. Ranking in the top 5 in the league in red zone targets in each of the last 6 seasons is incredibly impressive, and all of these stats show why Adams has been one of the most valuable fantasy assets in the league the last few years. The next thing I really like about Davante Adams' fantasy profile is his ridiculous efficiency. In 2021, Davante Adams averaged 3.24 yards per route, the third best among wide receivers. 0.72 fantasy points per route, the third best among wide receivers, and 2.04 fantasy points per target, the 12th best among wide receivers according to Player Profiler. This was not a fluke, as in 2020, Adams averaged 2.97 yards per route, the third best among wide receivers, 0.82 fantasy points per route, the third best among wide receivers, and 2.41 fantasy points per target, the fifth best among wideouts according to Player Profiler. This efficiency is insane considering the amount of volume he saw, and shows how great a player he is. The last thing I really like about Davante Adams' fantasy profile is his previous chemistry with Derek Carr. Going from Aaron Rodgers throwing you the ball to pretty much any other quarterback in the league throwing you the ball is likely to be a downgrade. But it is important to note that Davante Adams had a lot of success at the college level when Derek Carr was throwing him the ball. In the 2 seasons, 26 games that Davante Adams played with Carr at Fresno State in 2012 and 2013, Adams totaled 233 receptions, 8.96 per game, 3,031 receiving yards, 116.58 per game, and 38 receiving touchdowns, 1.46 per game according to Sports Reference. Having this previous chemistry should make the transition easier for Adams in 2022 than the typical wide receiver changing teams. Moving on to some of the concerns with Davante Adams' fantasy profile. New team. Davante Adams got traded from the Green Bay Packers to the Las Vegas Raiders this offseason, and with that, we'll see a change in everything. His quarterback, his offensive play calling, his competition, etc. As good as everything looks on paper, when there's this much change, there's always a possibility that something doesn't play out the way we thought it would, and it impacts Adams' fantasy value negatively. The next concern I have with Davante Adams' fantasy profile is that he's got more competition for targets in Las Vegas than he did in Green Bay. The 2021 Green Bay Packers pass catching group was one of the worst in the league outside of Davante Adams, so it was easier for him to see a massive target share. In Las Vegas, the team has a couple of other capable receiving weapons in tight end Darren Waller and wide receiver Hunter Renfrow. Playing with other talented pass catchers who will warrant targets may put more of a volume and targets cap on Adams than we've seen from him in the past. The last concern I have with Davante Adams' fantasy profile is his concussion history and his other minor injuries. Davante Adams has had multiple concussions over the course of his career in Week 6 of 2016, Week 4 of 2017, and Week 15 of 2017, which makes it more likely that he suffers another compared to other players. He's also had a bunch of minor injuries like ankle sprains, a shoulder sprain, knee sprain, hamstring strain, and a toe sprain. Some additional thoughts on Davante Adams' fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Davante Adams finished as the WR5 in Standard with 221.3 total fantasy points and 13.8 fantasy points per game. The WR3 and half PPR formats with 282.8 total fantasy points and 17.7 fantasy points per game, and the WR2 in full PPR formats with 344.3 total fantasy points and 21.5 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Davante Adams had 0 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 0 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 6 out of 16 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. In 2020, Davante Adams was the WR1 in Standard with 243.4 total fantasy points and 17.4 fantasy points per game. The WR1 in half PPR formats with 300.9 total fantasy points and 21.5 fantasy points per game, and the WR1 in full PPR formats with 358.4 total fantasy points and 25.6 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Over the course of Josh McDaniels' career as an NFL play caller, his wide receiver room as a whole has averaged 21.12 targets per game, which has resulted in pretty solid receiving production. Personal opinion: Davante Adams is going off the board as WR4, about pick 10 overall on ESPN, and WR4, about pick 13 overall on Yahoo. I think he's in the right ballpark range. I have him as the WR5 or WR6 right now, depending on the format. It's always a little risky to take a first or second round ADP wide receiver that changes teams, but Adams should still be a solid WR1 based on his incredible talent and previous chemistry with Derek Carr. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. According to Adam Schefter, Davante Adams has supported the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.